Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and I'm so delighted today to be joined by the wonderful writer and director Jared Frieder to talk all about his movie 3 Months. And I was interested in the way that you started visually shaping this film during the script writing process, and what some of the earliest visual aspects that we've ended up seeing on screen were that you started really working into the script, or some of the details that were really important to you from the beginning to be able to capture once you made it.
For me, something that visually was always felt paramount to this particular story was the color palette. Because I'm born and raised in South Florida. The movie takes place in South Florida. Being authentic to that experience was really important to me. And there is such like a distinct visual flavor to South Florida, Art Deco, pastels, that visual element not only helped represent where the story took place, but also Caleb, the protagonist's spirit. It felt colorful and unique, and it sort of reflects the kind of story that this is. So I think from a visual standpoint, that is something that was always in the script. That was really something we focused on, both in pre-production process, working with my DP and my production designer, designing that mini mart in the nice blues. It was something that was always top of mind and actually really fun.
Yeah. And one of the things that struck me in watching this movie is that there's certain moments and certain beats narratively that we've seen with characters going through a moment of, potentially having HIV, going through testing, waiting to see results. There's always that moment where all of a sudden the doctor's office gets exponentially smaller when they're in there because the camera kind of zooms in and does that trick, or even the moment where you have Caleb's just gotten punched and there's blood on his face, but no one even says anything about it. That's not a moment and that's not a scene. And was it really important to you narratively in the way that you told this story to take a lot of those instances that we've seen portrayed in films, that we've seen in television shows over not just even the last few years, but decades, and to really just subvert them and have that grounded day-to-day reality of what life is now to reflect that?
It's so great that you bring that up, because that was one of the reasons that I wanted to tell this story. I grew up loving queer stories, a lot of them that dealt with HIV, Angels in America, Rent. These are some of like the greatest queer stories. And what I wanted to do was sort of, like you said, subvert that and show what it's like to live with HIV now, which is thankfully, it's no longer a death sentence with access to modern healthcare, and being able to take, the image of blood, for example, like you bring up, and have it sort of take on a new meaning where, yes, of course, there are challenges. Yes, what he's going through is scary and anxiety provoking, but like he's going to be okay. And trying to use all of those moments that might be familiar in these types of stories and turn them on their head. Was definitely my intention with this film. I mean, it was a privilege to do so.
And within that scope of how you've told the story, you allow Caleb, who's the central character in the story, to have those moments where everything feels overwhelming. The uncertainty kind of weighs on him. It affects his relationships, but also you allow him to have moments where he's just living as a normal teenage kid, trying to figure out other things about his life. And he's completely distracted from that and not thinking about that. And so when you were structuring out the story, how did you determine what are going to be the beats and the moments where that is something that's at the front of his mind? And what are the moments where it's also important to show just kind of day-to-day living and other things that he's focused on as well?
It's always an ever-evolving process. Finding that balance is something that I did, in the rewriting process when we were on set. It was something that I still did in editing. It's part of the fun and the puzzle piece of a story like this. But it's also through living like this experience of the COVID-19 pandemic where, this is a story fundamentally about waiting, and like how life sort of happens while you wait and how you still have to fight for the things that you want, even while you're waiting. And we went into production on March 3rd, 2020, shot 2 weeks, and were shut down for 7 months when the world, crumbled down. And suddenly it was a film about a virus, and having to wait because of a virus was shut down by a different virus, COVID-19, and we had to wait in that uncertainty. So I went through another experience like this in the middle of making this film. And what I realized is like half the time I was getting stoned, binge watching television in bed and eating junk food. But I had written Caleb as such an active character because I like to write it's much easier to write active characters, even if they're in a period of waiting, that I didn't actually give him enough space to breathe. And like there was an authentic expression of waiting that I was going through that wasn't in the film. And so in that interim, I wrote the scene where he's literally binge watching The Real World in bed and eating donuts and getting high and just like being a kid, albeit in this strange and unique circumstance, but where he's just sort of like, you're able to feel his experience waiting and just feeling like a teenager who's stuck between here and there. And finding those moments was also like very fun.
Yeah. And you were bringing up having MTV's The Real World as an inflection throughout the film. And I thought that was such a great trajectory, going back to what we were talking about before, about what representation was at the time, but also the importance of seeing stories reflected on screen. And so how did you find the moments where you felt like that would really enhance the story and really tell us something about Caleb, particularly, like you said, that moment where he's just sitting in bed watching it, and it kind of tells us a little bit about his internalization at that moment?
It was such a cosmic coming together of things, because again, like, it was always my vision to honor like queer elders, queer people who fought for my rights so my life could be easier, and pay tribute to them and remember them. And I always wanted to do that in some way. And it just hit me when like I was like, we're on a tight budget, what can he be binge watching for free? And I was like, oh my God, MTV, we're made by MTV, The Real World San Francisco. And finding those moments, the first one when he's lying in bed and he's just found out he has to wait, and it's Pedro's roommate saying, oh no, like, I hope, like, I like him so much, I want him to be okay, which is sort of what the audience is thinking about Caleb. And in the middle, when he's sort of going through growing pains with his best friend and they get into a fight, and he's so desperate to find someone to love him romantically because he thinks that will mean that he's worthy of love, which is a very teenage sort of state of mind. And it's Pedro and his boyfriend Sean like being there for each other intimately. And then at the very end, I don't want to do a spoiler, but when he makes up with the person that he makes up with in the film, it's in reaction to the first same-sex commitment ceremony that was ever on television between Pedro and Sean on The Real World in the 90s. So each moment was very importantly picked to both honor Pedro and to help sort of to track Caleb emotionally on his journey.
Yeah. And you were bringing up one of the aspects of Caleb as a character, and just that real desire to feel wanted somewhere and to feel loved. And I thought it was a great choice, that it isn't just something where we hear a teenager be like, my mom didn't really want me and this was our relationship dynamic, but you also showed us, you made us see everything that he was saying was absolutely the truth, and it wasn't exaggerated in any form as well. And yet you also made it real by having the moment where, after his mom closes the door, we kind of see some of the turmoil inside of her and the conflict that she has within this very complicated relationship the two of them had. Did you know early on that it was a really vital thing to include showing that relationship on screen and have it not just be something that was referenced?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, thank you for saying that. It's like, for me, it's always show, don't tell, especially in a YA movie. I mean, I love voiceover. We didn't choose to do that here, but I feel like in a lot of YA coming of age stories, that does a lot of the work. And I wanted this to be more cinematic and to be able to sort of express everything that Caleb was going through by being on that journey with him, like sitting in his shoes and going for the ride. But I'm so grateful to Amy Landecker, who plays his mom, because she was like working with her and collaborating with her on this sequence, which is arguably one of the most important sequences in the entire film. It's the low point of the movie. It's where you see Caleb's the origin of his shame, which is what he's trying to sort of overcome on his journey. It is about him trying to confront that shame that his mom instilled in him. And, we had to go through 3 or 4 edits of that sequence in post, because we got a couple different versions. One that was a little bit more intense, one that was a little bit more comedic, and one that felt the most honest. And we went with the one that was the most honest. And that was the one that had her on the other side of the door. There's a version where we don't see her, where Caleb leaves and sort of that's it, and you don't return to her. And I'm so happy we included it, because it just makes her character more three-dimensional, and it, to me, again, it just feels more authentic.
Yeah. And with the fact that he is living with his grandparents, and that's where he does get the validation that he hasn't gotten from his relationship with his mother. Um, how did you land upon the choice to have Benny be kind of the first one of the two of them that we see really being like, you think that people don't love you and that they don't care about you and they're not here for you, but here's all the things that I do because I feel exactly that way about you.
Oh my God, I love that question. I Benny is someone, when I first wrote, the script's gone through so many different iterations, but the original opening scene was Caleb riding on the boardwalk and Benny in a seniors jogging group, and then passing each other and having just like the funniest interaction that was to the spirit of who they are, but you don't realize that like that's actually his grandpa until like a little bit later. So he was literally, when I first started writing the story, it was Caleb and Benny. Those were the first two characters. It's a figure that I feel is so important in Caleb's journey, because it is the person, it is both a story about chosen family, right? Where, like, as RuPaul says, we as queer people get to pick our family, and it's about the people who love us and who we love in return, even though we might not be biologically related. And Benny is that character. And I am so grateful that Louis Gossett Jr. said yes to this film. He is such a goddamn movie star. And that sequence where he gives that monologue, where he basically, like you said, like tells Caleb, like, I love you, here's how much you mean to me, you dumb shit, basically. Um, you could hear a pin drop on set. It was watching someone who is at the best at what they do just bring the house down. And that scene is it's the midpoint of the film. It is the emotional center, it's gravity. And it's one of my favorite scenes in the film.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think one of the aspects that also speaks to the isolation that Caleb feels in his life is, we get to see him going through the potential beginnings of a new romance with Esther. We get to see his friendship with Dara, but we don't see friendships and relationships that he has beyond that outside of his grandparents. We don't see people that he's been at school with. We don't see him with other groups of people. When we see him in those moments in between, it's him going down to the beach and kind of sitting by himself and being with himself. Did you always want to have moments that really reflected that? And was it a conscious choice very early on to be like, we're not going to show other friendships because these don't necessarily exist for this character? It's all about kind of like the close-knit people close to him.
I mean, absolutely. One of my favorite things about where the time period in which I decided to set this story is the summer between like high school and college. It's like the ultimate limbo. You know what I mean? So you're not in classrooms every day with 500 students. You're not, like going off on the journey where you move out of state and, start a new life at a university. It's sort of like the in between. And that lent both something that felt very unique, but an intimacy into the world, right? Like, we're just following Caleb on his day. And like, as like a queer dipshit high school kid, like I was, I didn't have a ton of close relationships. I had the people who stuck by me, who felt like they were there for me. But beyond that, it wasn't like a huge web of, social acquaintances. So it was also partially wanting to reflect that story, which again is not something you always see with coming of age stories. I feel like you're usually in a high school sort of setting experience, which I love. But I thought this was an opportunity to do something slightly different.
And if you look at the friendship between Caleb and Dara, there's moments of friction between the two of them. They do kind of start going down the journey of a falling out at one point. And it all feels very real because the stakes to them are very real. And so even if there's something happening for Caleb or any of the other characters, which isn't a heightened scenario, you kind of find the very realistic stakes of, well, what does it mean to that character? When you're that age, every emotion is kind of tenfold, and you're in this bubble and you haven't gone out into the world, and so you don't necessarily have the wider perspective of things, and so you feel things much more deeply at that point. And so how did you make sure that you were always servicing, well, what are the emotional stakes for this character in this moment?
It just I just went with the emotional stakes that felt real to me when I was a kid. You know, this is a movie. I sort of tried to make the movie that I wished I could have had when I was growing up. You know, for like, I mean, I hope it's for everyone. You know what I mean? Like straight people flock to this film. You know, people, but for me, like gay kids and gay teens, like I wanted to make something that made them feel a little less alone and a little bit more understood. And, you know, for me as a kid, those queer friendships were everything. They were my entire world. It's like, you know, so often you move through your town as a, you know, when you're younger and you're like, am I the only one of me? And to find a counterpart where, you know, Caleb found his gay best friend Dara, it's like the bond of that is like so insanely strong. I think it's one of the most powerful moments for a friendship like that, where everything does feel heightened, everything does feel real. You guys are getting your emotional needs met from each other because you're not getting them from other people yet. And that friendship to me is so interesting and exciting. And my best friend's a lesbian, and I just sort of wrote us, to be honest, is kind of the short answer to that question. But it was really nice to show that kind of a friendship.
Yeah. And with the developing romanticism that you have between Caleb and Esther, you know, I appreciated that kind of, again, it just that authentic element of it wasn't, oh, everything's super easy and comfortable and connected now that they found one another. It was like, yeah, they both really like each other, but neither of them really know what to do or what the next move should be. And even there's a scene that involves popcorn because that's an emotional connection between the two of them. And it's, you know, they kind of fumble through that moment together. And so there's a real sweetness to it. And it also brings them emotionally closer together. And so was that kind of a very similar thought pattern of like thinking back to that age for yourself and just what are those moments where you kind of are just fumbling through rather than finding the right graceful steps when we're all that age?
Oh, totally. I mean, absolutely. It's just, again, honesty was at the forefront when telling the story. And like, I was not smooth as a youngster. I mean, I had no idea what I was doing. And it feels like that's so relatable. And I think it just makes you get who these kids are. I think it makes you love them for the fact that they're not perfect. You know, they're awkward and they make mistakes. And that popcorn scene in particular, we worked so hard on the tone of that scene to make sure that everything felt correct, because I wanted it to be so sweet and romantic, but I also wanted it to be funny and awkward and sexy, and it was a lot of boxes to check. But it's one of my favorites. It's another one of my favorites too, because again, I would have loved to see that it's sort of young queer intimacy on screen when I was like a kid.
And with all of the characters, there's moments where there's cultural references but they're used in a very clever way in which it tells us a lot about the characters. You know, you've got two characters who are sharing their love of cinema and, you know, what did it mean to be watching Holly Golightly on the screen and Audrey Hepburn movies growing up, and how has that shaped who you are? You know, what does it mean when Esther references like, well, I feel like Taylor Swift stole my diary and wrote all about my life? You know, that tells us a huge amount about his emotional facet as a character. And so how did you find the cultural references that not only told us a lot about a character, but also that felt really timeless and won't be something that feels outdated 6 months from now, 2 years from now, that will kind of always hit that same referential point for audiences?
Yeah. Again, it's just sort of me being me. I mean, that line about I am Taylor Swift's number one fan, like in a very deep and real way. And I've often said out loud, you know, like it does feel like she steals my journal and writes about my life. And Caleb, when I wrote Caleb, I wrote the character I wished I could have been in high school, a little bit cooler than me, something that Troy really embodied so beautifully. Whereas Esta is the kid that I was in high school. So those references of Taylor or Breakfast at Tiffany's or Star is Born, you know, those just sort of felt real to me as like movies I liked to find as a queer kid that sort of opened my world to the art of filmmaking. And yeah, I think that's where those came from. But I love sort of pop culture references in stuff. It feels, especially like in 2011, finding the right ones that fit that world too was fun because 2011 was like a really formative time in my life too. So going back into that was exciting.
Yeah. And one of the scenes I really loved that allowed us to kind of like break away from the narrative a little bit, but still be within it, is the moment where you have Dara and Caleb at the mini mart, and it kind of feels like a music video for a couple of minutes prior
Mhm.
to them having consumed too many slushies and
Mhm.
ending very ungraciously for one of them. Where did the concoction of that scene and wanting to have kind of like almost an outside of like the regular walls and narrative structure of the film moment come from?
So that's a really, the genesis of that scene is really fun because, when I was meeting with my producers, the amazing Dan DeBecke and Laura Alameddine, who have made like my favorite movies, some that even inspired this, Juno, Up in the Air, Jennifer's Body. When they read the script, they were like, and this is something I've heard before about Caleb and Dara, and in different iterations, I had versions of this, but like, they're going through an emotional journey, but like, we want to see a moment where they are kids having fun, where you understand their bond and the joyful experience that they have together. And so I wanted to write this fun sort of dancey, youthful, young montage. And I wanted to be able to break form so slightly, not a complete tonal jump, but just enough where if I showed at the beginning of the sequence that they were taking shots and smoking weed, that as their brains opened up sort of during that sequence, our structure could open up a little bit. And it's so fun, it's so joyful, and like it gets to the heart of why tone was so important when making this movie, because it is about serious subject matter and the themes can get heavy, but it's a blast to watch, and that was such a conscious choice. I wanted it to be fun and funny and joyous and hopeful while also being, a little emotional and tender, and it was an interesting time balancing all those things.
Yeah, I mean, when you just kind of brought up the hopefulness tonally, that's exactly what comes away throughout the entire film, even when it's kind of allowing Caleb to sit and breathe in the experiences that he's going through. And that was what was really enjoyable about watching this film. So really appreciate you diving into all this detail and sharing so much. Thank you so much, Jared.
Oh my God, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.